Greetings, everyone. Saludos a todas y a todos. Welcome to the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. Welcome to our Latin America Center. I'm Oliver Kaplan, the director of the Latin America Center, and we're excited today to welcome you both in person here in the room and online on Zoom for our event on Venezuela negotiations, a light at the end of the tunnel, question mark. A very pressing topic, and I have to confess we haven't historically had enough coverage on Venezuela given all the events that have happened over recent years, and so it's really great for us to cover the issues happening today. I think with the recent some of the small breakthroughs in negotiations, it's an important moment to take stock of what's happened in recent months at the end of last year, and take a moment to ponder what we might be able to expect going forward if these negotiations can continue, what they might yield, what are some of the challenges. And unfortunately, our event today is only in English, not in Spanish, but maybe in a future occasion we can provide some additional content in Spanish. So with that, I'd like to welcome our moderator and really our organizer for the event, Professor Francisco Rodriguez, one of our new faculty members. We're really thrilled to have you here, Francisco. Francisco is the Rice Family Professor of the Practice who just recently joined us, and as many of you know, has a deep experience working on Venezuela and is from Venezuela, so really the perfect person to kick off our event. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Francisco, who will moderate the discussion and then moderate the questions. I would like to just thank Saraf Nawar for her assistance with organizing the event. So it doesn't happen without our staff here at the school. So with that, Francisco and our esteemed guest speakers, thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Thanks to all of you for being here today and joining us for this conversation on current events and developments and future potential developments in Venezuela. And many thanks to our speakers. We have a really great panel today, composed of some of the most prominent and I think most insightful people working on Venezuelan issues currently. And I'd like to say a little bit about each of them and introduce our topic of conversation and discussion. The idea today was to get together and talk about what's going on in Venezuela. There's been this off and on set of negotiations begun some time ago in Venezuela. And as of November of last year, they seem to get some new life with partial agreements that were announced, including some action by the government of the United States to support these negotiations. Today, to talk about what these talks hold, what are the real prospects that emerge for a breakthrough to the Venezuelan situation, whether there's a possibility of there actually being progress towards the realization of free and fair elections and an improvement in the human rights situation in Venezuela, or whether these negotiations will simply be used by some of the political actors to their advantage. We have three excellent and prominent speakers, and I'd like to introduce them. Carolina Jimenez Sandoval is the president of the Washington Office on Latin America. She, previously to being at WOLA, she was Deputy Research Director for the Americas at Amnesty International and Program Officer for the Open Society Foundation's Latin America program. Carolina is a leading human rights advocate, has become, in my view, one of the most important voices in the defense of the rights of vulnerable groups and human rights victims in the hemisphere. She has a PhD in International Studies from Waseda University in Japan and a Master's of Philosophy in International Relations from the University of Cambridge. Michael Penfold is a Global Fellow of the Latin America Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. He's a full professor of political economy and governance at the Instituto de Estudios Superiores de Administración, IESA, in Caracas, and is also a visiting professor at the Universidad de los Andes School of Government in Bogotá. Holds a PhD in political science from Columbia University. He's a co-author of a fantastic book, Dragon in the Tropics, Venezuela and the Legacy of Hugo Chavez, that is now in its second edition and was selected as the best book for the Western Hemisphere by Foreign Affairs. And Luis Vicente Leon has been the executive director of the Data Analysis polling company since 1994. Data Analysis is one of the most prominent Venezuelan polling companies, as well as, according to analysis of the historical performance of pollsters, one of the with the most consistently accurate track records in predicting Venezuelan elections. Luis Vicente is also a professor of political environment analysis at Instituto de Estudios Superiores de Administración, IESA, and of industrial economics at Universidad Católica Andrés Bello. He has a master's degree in business engineering from the Universidad Simón Bolívar. And Luis Vicente actually has a very special responsibility that none of the other panelists have, which is that it was his course in industrial economics that in large part motivated me to pursue graduate studies in economics. So I still remember when we discussed John Kenneth Galbraith's The New Industrial State over at the Módulo 4 of the Catholic University. And I'd really like to acknowledge it and feel very happy to be now in an academic setting where I can put into practice some of the experience that I got from a brilliant professor like Luis Vicente Leon. So let's kick it off and start out. I wanted to start out and have as fluid a discussion as possible. And I wanted to start off talking about the general political situation and the significance of these talks. And I wanted to start with Michael, talking about what this negotiation process means and how we can envision this process leading to a democratic transition in Venezuela. So Michael, what do you see as the prospects for this process to lead to an agreement that is enforceable, that both sides actually have incentives to comply with? Does the Maduro government actually, what are its objectives? What is it seeking to get out of this process? And are those objectives consistent with the democratization of Venezuela? And do you think that there is really a reasonable scenario in which this process ends in an election that is seen as conforming to the international standards of transparent elections by the international community, and in which the loser of those elections might actually recognize and, if necessary, hand over power to the winner?
Well, thank you, Francisco, and thanks for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to share my views on the current negotiations taking place in Mexico City. Let me start, Francisco, saying that the backdrop of these negotiations really is a domestic negotiation that was successful, that took place between the moderate wing within the opposition, that believed that there was an electoral solution to the Venezuelan quagmire, and also the Maduro regime that was willing to engage with some sectors of the opposition to deal with this regional and local elections that took place in 2021. And that negotiation that was conducted without international mediation, without the presence of the US or the US involvement, succeeded in several ways. First of all, it allowed to release over 100 prisoners. Second of all, it was able to appoint a new CNE that helped to invite the European Union to monitor the elections in 2021. And it also was key in convincing the more skeptical or more radical wing within the opposition that at the end, the only solution for Venezuela was going through some type of electoral contestation that could mobilize the vote. The outcome of that election was very mixed, but what it revealed was a system that in which Chavismo could lose, even though they were going to use all their powers, including the judicial branch, to reverse results which fortunately were then repeated, and Chavismo lost in the case of Paris. So I'm saying this because the current negotiation that is taking place with a very strong involvement from the US, with international mediation, okay, and with the participation of the more radical wing with the opposition, it comes into place only after the opposition is now in a moment where they have had to abandon a theory of political change that did not work, which was based exclusively on the use of international sanctions, that was based on the idea that international isolation was going to create fractures, particularly within the armed forces, and that domestic factors were not as important as mobilizing international resources, right? So we come into this moment at a time where the opposition right now is very fragmented, very divided. It doesn't have many other alternatives as probably they had 2 or 3 years ago to a negotiated settlement. And for me, what they're negotiating is not a democratic transition at this point. Is a political opening of some sort, which we still have to see exactly in what terms it's going to take place. So on the other hand, Chavismo comes into this negotiation with a dramatic, different international context, particularly within Latin America, with the dissolution now of the interim government, and also with a very poor performance in terms of leadership within the polls, right? So at this point, you know, the leverage that the opposition has is very small, and in fact, they have become completely dependent on the U.S. To leverage certain types of outcomes within this process of negotiation that is mediated by Norway. Now, the US also comes into this negotiation in a very different position. One, with an important change in foreign policy towards Venezuela that has been very gradual, almost forced by different types of events, and particularly with the fact that they haven't been able to achieve what they wanted, which was a regime change, and in a Latin American context where Colombia is now recognizing Maduro, Lula is recognizing Maduro, Boric is also too, and most of Latin America, including Mexico, are also recognizing Maduro. So this is the context, right? So my view is that Chavismo, what they want at this point is key for them, is to have an election that implies some marginal improvements compared to what they had pacted with more moderate factors within the opposition in 2021. So that allows for Europe to monitor the election, that is not a fully competitive election, but it's competitive enough for the international community to legitimize, right? So they believe they can achieve that. And at the same time, they can achieve that in a context where they're going to tell the US, either we get this and you remove all international restrictions, particularly US sanctions on the central bank and PDVSA on the oil sector, and also removing key individual sanctions on key individuals within the regime, including Maduro himself, right? So my view is that this process is going to be, in terms of the outcome, is going to be limited. Chavismo also comes to the negotiating table with full control, not only of the judicial branch, with full control of the majority of governorships, which they won in 2021, with the majority of mayorships, which they also won in 2021, with the electoral international monitoring of the EU, and the only thing, and they also the only thing that they need to have a full hegemonic system that now has international legitimacy is to win the presidency in 2024, right? So this is the main issue. What that means is that they're going to open up, and I think the incentives for them to open up are important because they see the political upside of doing this, especially after defeating what their perception is that they have defeated this theory of change that was based on this huge international pressure. On behalf of the opposition believes that the only leverage they have at this point are international sanctions, which depend on the US a willingness to remove them or not. And here we're entering into a view within the US that is completely different from the Trump administration, by which they think that basically sanctions are incentives for achieving a negotiated outcome. Before, the view was that sanctions should not be used to negotiate. They just should be used to exercise pressure over the regime, right? So that's an important change. Now, I think this view is also very limited because I think that the US can use sanctions, and they have done that by flexibilizing, for example, oil sanctions and allowing Chevron now to export oil back to the US. They can be used to bring Chavismo into the table, and they can be used to create an environment by which Chavismo might be willing to engage with the process. It has taken a lot of time and effort on behalf of the US for Chavismo to accept to sit down in Mexico City after the talks were interrupted for over a year. But it took for the US two key concessions. One was the Chevron license, which it's already in place and it's working. In fact, Chevron is going to increase production in January from 80,000 barrels per day to over 120,000 barrels per day in a month, with the ability to sell that oil in the United States, which is a different ballgame altogether for PDVSA. But at the same time, they also agreed, to create a social fund, which is going to be, it's going to have around $3 billion from unfreeze assets that Venezuela holds abroad. But so far, the US has not disbursed these funds for the UN to administer, based on the decisions that are going to be made by a committee, both by the opposition and Chavismo, where they're going to basically choose the kind of humanitarian projects, choose who might execute those projects, and verify whether the funds have been used or not. And the fact that these resources have not been unfreezed is giving the Chavismo the perfect excuse to continue interrupting the talks. So talks are right now in a difficult moment, and the expectations is that the next time they sit around, perhaps in February, they're going to now start dealing with the political agenda. I'll conclude, Francisco, to your question, that whatever is negotiated in Mexico City at this stage is going to be strictly political and electoral. I don't see Chavismo negotiating, many other things. They might do that if they lose the election in 2024. At this point, they're hoping that with a divided opposition, with some kind of minimum concession on the political front, they can win the election, they can win the presidency again with full international legitimacy and consolidate their hegemonic control over power in Venezuela.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Michael. And I think that those are really valuable insights, and something that you pointed to is this idea that the opposition is no longer negotiating for a transition, but is rather negotiating for a political opening. So I'd like to shift to Carolina and ask, within that setting, how do we exactly put a human rights lens on these negotiations? I mean, we're talking about a government that has, according to the description that Michael has given us, has emerged strengthened out of this crisis. We're talking about a transformation in the theory of change of the opposition, where the opposition is thinking about much more limited demands. And we're also talking about a government that has been accused and is currently facing an investigation by the International Criminal Court prosecutor for crimes against humanity. This is the first time that a government faces an investigation of this type in Latin America since the signing of the Rome Statute. How do these facts impact the possibility of reaching a negotiated solution in Venezuela and of making progress on the human rights front? Can we think of a process, for example, of transitional justice in which human rights violations are dealt with, which is also compatible with a negotiated transition? Or if we have a government that is simply not really discussing its handing over of power, what are the real prospects for there to be progress in addressing human rights violations in Venezuela?
Thank you, Francisco, for the invitation, of course, and thank you for including, a discussion on the Venezuela negotiations that needs to bring a human rights perspective, which is sometimes sadly left out, although it is incredibly important for the country. And it is important because, unfortunately, Venezuela needs to be seen as a country full of victims. There are thousands of victims of extrajudicial execution, thousands of victims of arbitrary detention, of torture, and other types of state-sponsored violence. So these victims have sought justice. I mean, we know when we speak to many victims who have taken their cases, to Venezuelan courts, to no avail. I mean, it is precisely because of the lack of justice internally in Venezuela that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, took this historic decision to open an investigation. Within this very complex human rights scenario, the negotiations start and now have resumed. When you look at the memorandum of understanding signed by the parties, you see that one key point in the agenda is the respect for the rule of law and reparation for victims. So I think there is a clear acknowledgement from both parties that this needs to be addressed. The big question, of course, is how to address this and how do we reach an agreement that is satisfactory for both parties when, and we have to say this, one of the parties is where the perpetrators are, and I think you said it, when you posed the question. This calls for a different type of justice, or this calls for a justice which is implemented in a very specific context, a context where a country wants to move away from an authoritarian system of government to return or to rebuild a democracy. Now, this implies, and this is, let's face it, very difficult, that there needs to be an agreement that is satisfactory for all without this agreement constituting a blank check for impunity. I mean, this precisely because alleged the crimes against humanity has been committed, we're speaking about individual responsibilities at the highest levels of government. That's why the ICC is involved. Does it sound impossible? Well, yes. Is it impossible? No. The truth is that there are many instances and there are many historical experiences in other parts of the world and even in Latin America where, two or more parties have been able to agree on transitional justice systems where the agreement includes truth, justice, non-repetition, and reconciliation. But for this to happen in a country like Venezuela, especially, you need this process to be legitimate for the victims and for civil society. And that is why it's so important that these voices are included and taken into consideration in the negotiations. At some point, the parties need to open a channel for victims and for NGOs or other parties to be able to provide expertise, to be able to provide input, and to be able to express, what they need for human rights violations to be addressed in a way that we can build from our own experience a transitional justice system that does not represent impunity, but is satisfactory for all the parties. The debate has started. There are organizations working on this, but if there isn't a commitment at the table in Mexico, where these voices are included, I'm afraid that we may end up with a process that does not satisfy victims and civil society, and therefore will probably not be sustainable over time.
Thanks very much, Carolina. And I think that this insight of trying to look at the Venezuelan process from the standpoint of the victims is extremely important, and it really changes our perspective when we start asking this type of questions. And there are many victims to Venezuela's humanitarian tragedies. Some of them are victims of the crimes of arbitrary detention, of torture. Others are victims of the acute decline in living standards, of economic conditions, the huge economic contraction, the massive migration exodus. Venezuela is facing the deepest documented economic and humanitarian crisis seen in the modern history of the Western Hemisphere. And I'd like to shift to Luis Vicente and tackle the issue of what exactly can the international community do and can be done within this negotiation process to find ways to address this humanitarian crisis. There's an agreement that was reached in November that contemplates the use of around $3 billion to attempt the emergency. Michael already alluded to it. However, we haven't seen any further announcements since November regarding the use of those funds. We've seen some discussion by some negotiators on the side of the opposition about some of the obstacles that they're facing. Maduro seems to be blaming the opposition in the United States for what he claims is a stalling in the implementation of plans, and has even threatened with suspending the negotiations if the funds are not dispersed. So do you think that we're going to see this fund enter into operation? Do you think that we're actually going to see the UN administering the money from Venezuelan frozen accounts? And what do you think are the main obstacles? For example, the opposition has talked about the risk that the funds will be attached by creditors who are seeking to collect on Venezuelan defaulted debt. The last time that the UN was involved in a plan of this scope was with the Iraq Oil for Food program. And that, of course, led to the rise of a set of corruption scandals that have left many actors cautious with approaching this type of agreements. Can there be reasonable safeguards set in place to avoid having a similar experience recur in the case of Venezuela?
Yes, well, thank you, Francisco, for the invitation. Well, of the substance, it's important to indicate that this social agreement was the product of many negotiations in which both the opposition, the Maduro government, and Biden government, United Nations, all of them participated. It lasted for months of discussions and ended in a social agreement that really represented a general framework for who needed a lot of details later. And as American says, the devil is in those details. So we have a framework, but we don't have how to implement the social agreement in Venezuela. The general framework serves to sit down in Mexico and move forward with the Chevron oil license. Almost everybody needs to go to Mexico to finish the license, and the social agreement was part of the necessity to go to Mexico, but we didn't. But after Mexico, very quickly after the agreement, the most important complication arose was that the American government stated saying that they cannot rent it, not be demanded by the international creditors of Venezuela, and in particular, those of PDVSA. And there was no mechanisms offered by the government of the United States to protect them as it has done with other assets, something that the negotiation had taken for granted. The negotiators talk about it in the process, and they took as a granted that the identification and unfreezing of sources in the countries where the money is, because the largest amount of resources is not in the United States. We know that, Portugal, Belgium, Japan, etc. But in reality, it's frozen because of the American sanctions. And it was suggested that the government of Maduro and the opposition had to go find and negotiate these processes individually. For the Maduro government and for the opposition, this represented a change of direction and a breach of what was promised in the previous negotiation. While for the United Nations, for example, it represented an atomic bomb that radically changed its ability to trigger the social agreement and maintains semi-frozen any advance of the social projects they hope to be financed in this way. So this is the situation right now. There have been subsequent meetings in DC that have opened new doors to activate the agreement and move forward. And the American government, in fact, has been more receptive with the opposition on the subject. This is obvious that without them, the possibility of success is absolutely new. You cannot operate any social agreement without the support of the American government. But even if the money is not there, but it is still a process in progress. Time is passing, and what we really expected to happen this year is much lower than the initial expectation that we were created around. But obviously the institutions and the world have learned from their own mistakes, and there are many more mechanisms to reduce that risk, not to eliminate, but at least to create mechanisms to control it. And United Nations certainly has them, even if they are not infallible. But even with the current of the government of Venezuela and the Venezuelan opposition, with both have shown that they are, capable of things to me, everything. I think it's a good idea. Even though United Nations can present a lot of problems, it's by far better than money controlled by the government of Venezuela or money controlled by the own opposition. We saw the problems controlling the international assets of Venezuela. We have a lot of cases with it right now. The problem is precisely the idea of avoiding another scandal like the one you mentioned makes the process at the United Nations very bureaucratic, and their execution can be slow, with which the impact are diluted over time. So in fact, I think that we are going to see, the agreement. We are going to see some money flowing to Venezuela, but it's going to be by far less than the $3 billion that we mentioned. Maybe this year we can see something like 100 to 200 million dollars focusing on very specific issues, but this is not going to change the crisis that Venezuela is living today.
Okay. Thanks so much for giving us all of those details about the negotiation process and the details with the management of assets. And it seems that we are entering a new period in which there's going to be progressive lessening and loosening of both economic and personal sanctions. We've already seen some examples. And I wanted to come back to Carolina for a moment to ask, given that sanctions have also been an important tool used by the international community, not just the US, but also the European Union and other key actors in defense of human rights in Venezuela and in other settings, how does this environment of loosening of sanctions, what does it mean for the human rights situation? Do you think that Venezuela sanctions have been effective at containing human rights violations? And is it possible to think about other modalities of pressure that the international community can use to maintain its stance in defense of Venezuela's human rights that are not dependent on sanctions, and particularly on economic sanctions, because we have those two instruments in which there's quite some controversy. There's much more uniform use of personal sanctions, and then there's the use of the sectoral economic sanctions, which have been imposed by the United States.
Well, I'm glad you made the differentiation between individual and economic sanctions, because in general, civil society organizations do not oppose individual sanctions against human rights perpetrators. And that's not just the case of Venezuela. If you talk to Central Americans these days, they welcome US sanctions against, some political connections of President Bukele. If you talk to Guatemalans, they welcome individual sanctions against the Attorney General of Guatemala, appointed by President Yamatei, who has been persecuting journalists, NGOs, etc. So I think we should make that difference. So in that sense, a well-defined and clear strategy around individual sanctions is not necessarily bad news for human rights. Now, economic sanctions are a very different story, and you, Francisco, have published extensively on this issue and on the impact these sanctions has had on the economy and therefore on the enjoyment of economic, cultural, and social rights, which are as important as civil and political rights. So it is true that the pre-existing humanitarian crisis the country was facing was deepened because of the economic sanctions imposed by the Trump administration. And in that sense, you cannot argue that they have been beneficial for human rights. What I do think is that there are indeed many other ways to put pressure and to prevent human rights violations. When you look at everything that has happened around the UN fact-finding mission, a mechanism that has been incredibly important for NGOs, for victims, for human rights in general. But as we know, it is a mechanism the Maduro government has strongly opposed in all international forums. I think you can see how useful this type of mechanisms can be, not just to document, which is a very key objective of this type of mechanism, but also to prevent. What many organizations said in Venezuela is that after the publication of the first report in 2019, we saw the decrease in certain type of human rights violation, especially extrajudicial executions. And although the government, of course, denied that the findings were real, clearly some key members of the security forces were observing, and this wasn't any mechanism. This was a mechanism created by the UN Human Rights Council. So it does have, plenty of international legitimacy and international recognition. So if you have that type of monitoring internationally that can contribute to the reduction of human rights and to documenting what has happened, I think those are more useful and less harmful ways, to prevent human rights violations. And the international community plays a very key role in supporting this mechanism. I mean, these mechanisms need to be supported, they need to be staffed, they need to have doors opened with different countries of the world where they can do the work, especially because Venezuela has never given the experts access into the country, as we know. So I think governments, of course, issue different types of individual sanctions, but we do think that when governments coordinate and the approach is multilateral and not unilateral, these type of strategies are much more effective. And we certainly don't oppose sanctions against human rights abuses, but economic sanctions, unfortunately, in many places where they are applied, have a very, very high impact on the population. And if you support human rights, you cannot possibly support the impact on economic and social rights that these type of sanctions tend to have in different countries and I guess many people.
Thanks so much, Carolina. I think you brought up a very interesting point in your previous intervention, which also made its way into this one, which is in the negotiation processes, who has a voice at the table, who are the groups that are represented, and how do we ensure that not only the rights, but also the voice of victims is heard in the negotiations. And that brings us to and opens up this broader question of representativeness of the sides that are negotiating. And we've seen over the course of the past few days how the unitary platform, which has been the mainstream Venezuelan opposition coalition, seems to have splintered into different groups. There was a particularly acrimonious debate that occurred on December 30th that led to the dissolution of the country's interim government, led by Juan Guaido and recognized by, at some moment, a large number of countries, more recently, a handful of countries. That leads me to a couple of questions which I have for Michael, which is, one of them is, how representative and how coherent is the unitary platform as a counterpart for the negotiations, given, number one, its internal divisions, and number two, the fact that according to election studies and according to public opinion studies and according to electoral returns, a large fraction of Venezuelans do not see themselves represented by politicians, either of the unitary platform or of the Maduro government. In the November 2021 regional elections, the Democratic Unity Roundtable, which is that same coalition, obtained only 40% of all of the votes cast against Maduro. So it seems that we have a problem of representativeness in terms of voters. We have a large number of elected governors and mayors from the opposition that don't have a seat at the table. We have an active and organized civil society. We have a business sector. We have workers' movements. We have civil society organizations. We have human rights organizations. Wouldn't it make more sense to start thinking about, say, a multilateral negotiation process like what took place in South Africa, where different actors and different constituencies have a seat at the table, and which can also give an agreement a much more solid base of support in civil society when that agreement has to be presented to Venezuelans?
Well, Francisco, I fully agree with you that the crisis of representation within the opposition is varied. And it goes beyond what we have seen in the past. It's acrimonious right now, right? And it's a blame game that has to do with the fact that the opposition is turning now to the domestic front, and it's finding itself that people feel completely disconnected from their own discourse, that was very much focused, almost exclusive, on lobbying international governments, and particularly the White House and the US Senate, right? So the reality is that voters, right, and society perceives themselves as very distant from the current leadership. Then, so that's I think this dynamic between that emerges from these two different theories of change, one that is completely based on this international pressure, and this other one that was sort of a very minority voice of boycotting elections is not always a good idea, and that the opposition needed to interact on an electoral path, which is now starting to emerge as sort of a common understanding of what needs to happen in that negotiation in Mexico City. Now, let me tell you another thing. There's going to be elections here for presidency in 2024. Okay, there's another very important election in Venezuela in 2025 for the National Assembly, for governorships, and for mayorships again. So now the opposition is realizing that boycotting elections with that schedule ahead is basically not an option, right? So at the end, whether they're at this point, unlike previous processes of negotiations like in the DR in 2018, the opposition was negotiating whether they would participate or not, under what conditions, right? Here, I think it's different. Here, I think they're negotiating the terms of their reinsertion within the political system as it stands. Because as it stands, as I said, Chavismo controls the presidency, controls the courts, has a supermajority in the National Assembly, controls governorships, controls mayorships. They're under full control, right? So the opposition needs to look at this in very different stages. And the only way to have a picture where they can move ahead requires a lot of strategic coordination among them. And without that, I think that sitting down with different voices and more plural, which I agree should have been done, I'm not sure it's going to change much, right? Because the other thing is that the US basically recognizes this opposition that is sitting in Mexico City, which is the unitary platform. Having said that, I'll conclude here. The unitary platform is key. If they don't get their act together, Chavismo will be able to win just as Rafael Caldera won in 1994 with less than a third of the vote, because you're going to have many different candidates. You're going to have very little coordination of the vote, just as it happened in the regional elections in 2021. The opposition could have won over 16 governorships in 2021. And they didn't because, one, there was a very important faction with the opposition that was boycotting the election, okay? And the others, because they didn't coordinate the vote sufficiently enough. And there's this case of Barinas where they finally came together and they were able even to beat the regime after it taking over the governorship through a judicial decision and repeating the election again and winning it. So they need to do that. Now, I fear right now that this is gonna require a different vision. For example, the US, and this is something I'm gonna be very open about this. I think the US is too close to the opposition at this point. They sometimes think that the opposition needs to be pampered, need to be coordinated by them. They need to influence, the decisions because they need to coordinate the sanction policies and the political unity. But I think at this point, what the opposition needs is to turn home, reconnect with society, and come to terms with the fact that they need to reorganize in a different way. And that takes courage and that takes leadership. And I think that this goes beyond this discussion about the interim government, whether it was justly dissolve or unjustly dissolve. The reality is the interim government, from having 56 countries that recognize the interim government, there were less than 6 countries now that were recognizing the interim government, among them the US and Canada, right? And then Paraguay. But Colombia, which was a big loyal partner to the US on their theory of change, is now fully recognizing Maduro, but is also committed to this negotiation process in Mexico City. So at the end, beyond Mexico City, if the opposition is not able to get their act together, which means reaching out to different groups, even groups that before they were labeled in very different ways, but that actually they need those votes to win the presidency. Because without them, I think that the kind of obstacles they're going to face during a presidential election are going to be very, very, very important. Because I don't think those elections are going to be fully competitive. As I said, Maduro is going to negotiate a political opening. He'll try to time the election. He will try to time what kind of bans he removes on candidates, who is allowed to participate or not. But the opposition needs to play this game because it's the only game left that they have at this point. But without connecting to society again and to their social issues and to the real problems, without that, it's not going to happen. Look, the unions in the last year or two stopped talking about the international community and, they focus on their main issues. Salaries, income. And they've been able now to start mobilizing important sectors of society. I think the politicians need to start doing the same.
Thanks, Michael. So you put forward this prospect, which isn't a very nice one, of Maduro winning the 2024 elections, even with a minority share of the vote. So I'd like to turn to Luis Vicente, who is our pollster in the room, and first of all, tell us whether he agrees with that, and also how are you seeing the electoral landscape in Venezuela? Is Maduro has the economic recovery that has occurred over the past 2 years? Has that positively affected Maduro? How are people seeing the Venezuelan opposition? There was a moment back in 2019 where leaders like Guaido had very high approval ratings. That's changed. Are there any type of figures in the opposition that are now inspiring Venezuelans? And do you see anybody coming out with the possibility of unifying this opposition vote, which, as Michael said, needs to be unified? Are we going to see an outsider emerge, or is there just going to be kind of greater disengagement by Venezuelans from political, including electoral issues? Luis Vicente? I think I think you froze. Okay.
Now?
Now, okay, yeah.
Okay, well, what I'm trying to say is that I totally agree with Michael with the idea that in 2024, we are not going to have a transparent and competitive election. We are going to have maybe some better conditions and maybe the opposition participating there. I don't think they are going to participate unified. I see it very difficult, but maybe the primary election can obtain one candidate who accumulate the majority of the support, etc. But being honest, I don't think that Maduro is going to 2024 election if he thinks that he's going to lose. He can negotiate things to obtain like a kind of legitimacy, to take advantage of the changes in Latin America, to try to recover some kind of links with the international community. But he is not going to take the risk to lose in the election. It could happen, always you can make mistakes, but he's going to try to negotiate wherever except his head. accept something that could put him into risk. So this is the framework where the election is going to happen. Some negotiations, maybe some opening in the political field, maybe the possibility that the opposition relaunch his own participation in the future in 2025 with governors, mayors, or especially the National Assembly. But I don't think the situation in the presidential election is going to be very easy for the opposition. We are in the first minute of the Rocky movie, and everybody's talking about the referee or the quantity of rounds that we are going to have. In reality, Rocky needs to run for kilometers, miles, and fight and pass the whole movie to go and to be capable to face the enemy. And we have a long, long way to do that. But in terms of the leaders and the possibilities, etc., in reality, the Venezuelan population is very disconnected from politics right now. Perhaps the basic reason is that despite having a clearly majority desire for change, over 70% of Venezuelans want changes in the government. Their hope that the opposition will be capable of provoking it has plummeted to levels close to 10%, which indicate that 9 out of 10 Venezuelans don't believe that the institutional opposition can remove Maduro from power. Without that hope, his connection with the opposition leadership and even with the Chavismo, but with the opposition leadership was pulverized. And there is practically no relevant leader in terms of popularity. I rescue, however, that Venezuelan, even despite their relevant rejection by Maduro, maintain a positive connection. Now, it looks crazy, but in any poll, when you ask about Chavez's popularity, Chavez is above 50% of popularity even now. This is absolutely incredible, but it's happening. It's still happening in Venezuela right now. In reality, well above the rest of the national leaders, you cannot find too many people connecting Venezuelans or talking Venezuela. Of course, in this very moment, you cannot see anybody challenging Maduro in reality inside the Chavismo, and you are seeing a lot of fractures and divisions inside the opposition. From the presidential or primary point of view, the issue is even more complex. The election is far away right now and still uncertainty. The political debate is poor and without relevant leaders. It's like a competition between Lilliputians in Venezuela right now. Of course, I can tell you who is, the tallest Lilliputian, but everything would change dramatically around the hot momentum. So we are far from it. Anyway, the answer to the question is that, for example, when we ask about who has to be the elected at this time to be above 20 or 25% of the voters, and it could be overestimated by the survey. So with abstention, you can see some guys there. For example, Manuel Rosales and Maria Corina Machado are the ones in the first position, almost tied in the first position. But the percentage of votes, even for primary, is 7 and 6%, respectively, leaving the second, third, or fourth position to Falcón, Capriles, Aguaidó, in third, fourth, and fifth position, but all of them very, very small. There is a strong impact on the average by regions. For example, Rosales is very strong in Zulia state. Falcón takes some votes from the center, from Barquisimeto, Lara, etc. And Maria Corina is, having the support of the radicals, the people who is absolutely, angry at what is happening in Venezuela, and they want everything. It's like a kind of rebellion or something like that. But anyway, if I ask who can win this election, I think the most important issue here is that if we are talking about primary elections is not going to be win by the most popular guy. It's going to be in the hands of the most important alliance that we can create in estimating that you can have an ally between, for example, Rosales, Capriles, and Acción Democrática. This is a very important ally, and they can move people to the election, because we need to move electors. Otherwise, everybody could win with almost nothing. This ally could be important. Maria Corina Machado could build an alliance with the the radicals, but she's going to compete with Guaidó in that field. Negotiations inside the opposition, but at the same time, she is the one increasing the best. So she was starting in less than 3%, and now she is tied with Rosales, and we don't know what is going to happen in the future with this. So, being honest, in this very moment, it's almost impossible to predict what is going to happen. But what is clear is that if you, for example, in the poll, you, for example, introduce Lorenzo Mendoza, or El Conde del Guácharo, an humorist who is in the election or whatever, the people, try to, to support them because they are provoking changes in terms of popularity. But if you see the numbers in terms of votes, the majority of the outsiders are not bigger. Think that the traditional leaders or even the insiders, like the small political leaders who are participating in the campaign, could be is easy, and the main scenario is still that Maduro is going to control this election.
Well, thanks so much. So we have, I think, quite a few questions from the audience. So I'm going to hand over the microphone. You might not be able to see the people asking the questions, I think, or I'm not sure, but you'll definitely be able to hear them. So yes, let's go ahead.
Can't see me. My name's Kelsey. I just have a question for Carolina. I don't know a lot about Venezuela and what's going on with the ICC, but I was really curious. Have there been cases in the International Court of Human Rights? And if so, what was the timeline compared to when the ICC investigation began, or how it's been? Thanks.
Could you repeat, Rodrigo, Francisco? I think she asked about the ICC, but I couldn't.
Yes. Why don't you come up and just.
Do you want me to turn this off?
Yeah, I think so.
I don't know if I did that. Hi, can you hear me?
Very well.
Okay, perfect. Hi, my name is Kelsey. I just wanted to know, with the ICC investigation, I don't know, has there already been a case, or have there been cases in the International Court of Human Rights, Inter-American Court of Human Rights? And if so, what was that timeline compared to the investigation at the ICC?
Okay, these are two different courts, right? Because the international, the ICC is a criminal court, and it investigates cases to identify individuals who are responsible for certain type of crimes, including crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, etc. So the ICC looks at individuals who are responsible for very, very serious crimes, not just any crime, right? And crimes against humanity are those crimes that, because of its, magnitude, are considered crimes against humanity as a whole. And the Inter-American Human Rights Court is a court where states are examined and investigated. And unfortunately, Venezuela is no longer part of the Inter-American system. President Chavez denounced the American Convention in I think it was in 2013. And right now, the court cannot hear, the Inter-American Human Rights Court cannot hear cases on Venezuela because we're no longer part of the American Convention. What I think is important to understand about the ICC and Venezuela and negotiations is that, first, the ICC, it's a mechanism, yes, to investigate cases that are not receiving any justice inside the countries. But we need to be honest, and to understand that this can take decades. The ICC is not a mechanism where cases are investigated and trials take place at full speed. On the contrary, it's a very difficult process. And it takes years. And I want to bring an anecdote I heard from a Colombian colleague once about the peace process in Colombia and the ICC. When the peace process started in Havana, the ICC had opened a preliminary exam on Colombia. So it was there because, there was an armed conflict, and of course, war crimes and crimes against humanity were committed. It was a very long conflict. And NGOs, victims and civil society groups were in Havana. That's why that, peace process is seen in many ways as an example, because it was very inclusive. It included the voices and the perspectives of victims and of civil society. And so a very high commander of the FARC, of the guerrilla group, was talking to civil society. And talking to this very well-known human rights lawyer in Colombia. And this commander tells the human rights lawyer, there is one thing in which we agree with the gringos, right? There is one thing in which we agree with the Americans. We do not like the ICC. And the ICC, and the US is no part of the ICC, as we know. So I do think that these type of mechanisms also have a political impact. And they are judicial mechanisms. They are mechanisms for, for investigations, for trials, but you can not divorce this from political reality. And that's why we think that it is an important venue for victims to achieve the justice they do not find in Venezuela, but it also has a political weight that needs to be taken into consideration when we, analyze the overall scenario of the negotiations.
Can I ask a follow-up, or should I? No,
Well, the thing is that we have several questions from the chat and maybe other people from the audience. We have 20 minutes, so.
Never mind. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So we have a few questions from the Zoom chat, and I'm going to put them out here. And just to see a show of hands, other people in the audience also want to ask questions? Okay, so we have at least one. So let me group them in twos according to well, hopefully they're similar enough. So from the chat we have a question by Carlos Rodriguez Lopez from Florida International University, who writes, considering the restrictions on NGOs announced yesterday by the National Assembly, is Chavismo still willing to make the democratic concessions in Mexico City that would comply with American expectations? And we have another question that arrived. This is from Nicole Yapur at Bloomberg News, she asked for any of the panelists, regarding the social agreement, the opposition said that it would start traveling to European countries that hold funds belonging to Venezuela, seeking to unlock them for the humanitarian agreement. Do you think these efforts are going to have a positive result? Should we be optimistic about them? So let's try to tackle those two questions.
I would love to, to answer a part of them. First of all, the difficult, in and out, they fight, etc. It's normal. They are negotiating. So sometimes people think that when Maduro or the opposition declare against the other or attacking somebody, the negotiation is over. In reality, the negotiation is always there. Negotiation is not Mexico necessarily. Mexico sometimes is just a notary to sign what you finally obtain in a huge quantity of negotiations who happen in Venezuela or happen by Zoom or happen by WhatsApp. They are negotiating every day. And in some moment, they finally obtain something and decide to present it and go to Mexico to do it. This is the reality for a while. And maybe in the future, it's not going to be in Mexico. Maybe it could be wherever, in Caracas or wherever. But if you understand that, everybody in a negotiation start asking for a lot of things, but they know that they are going to accept by far less than that. It's like a union negotiation with the employers or the private sector or wherever. They start asking for a huge salary, but they have some amount in mind that they can agree in after months of negotiation. For example, it's asking for a long list of things to recognize the presidential election in 2024. They are asking, for example, for the date of the presidential election, the National Assembly, to eliminate the ban for the leaders of the opposition in order to allow them to participate in the presidential election. They want the international observers. They want to recover the political parties, the one utilized by the Supreme Court of Chavez. They want to apply the recommendations of the European observers in the last election. So they have a list, a shopping list of things in order to recognize this election like a legitimate election. But if you go, for example, for Europe, you are going to see that they are, in this very moment, by far more pragmatic. They understand that these elections are not going to be absolutely democratic, but they recognize that is even without being democratic, transparent, etc., we need an election. And we need to stimulate the opposition to participate, to organize, to relink the relation with the people. So they accepted, for example, an election in 2024 with by far less conditions than the United States. They want a date for the presidential election. They want, in fact, habilitate some leaders, maybe not all of them, but some of them. And they, of course, need the observers, international observers in the election. If Maduro gives to the opposition these conditions, maybe they are going to obtain the support of Europe to this election. And if you go further and go to Latin America countries, Brazil or Colombia or Peru, as you mentioned, Francisco, give me the date and the observers, and I am going to Caracas to see this election and try to solve the problem in terms of the recognition of the new government in the future. Because not recognizing the government of Venezuela is a huge problem for the majority of them. So if you understand that, you understand that Maduro is going to give something, but he's not going to give the Christmas list of United States. They are going to give some of them in order to create some conditions to opening. If the opposition is smart, is going to accept it. Why? Because Europe and Latin American are going to put pressure on the United States to finally accept something better than now, even if not perfect, democratic election in the future. And we are going to the 2025 election, as Michael mentioned, to continue relaunching the opposition, because the opposition is so weak right now to be, the winner in Venezuela. Finally, it is absolutely connected with the trip to Europe that Nicole asked. Why? Because I think that the opposition in Venezuela is changing. They decide to dismiss the interim government because in reality, the interim government doesn't represent them anymore. And it creates fractures, more fractures inside than articulation, organization. They create, for example, blockers for the negotiation or for the flexibility of sanctions, because the interim government doesn't believe in flexibilization. They believe in other way. I am not criticizing them. It's a different position. But this position block negotiations, block the possibility to advance. And now they have another quantity of problems in representation, etc. But they have more unity in order to negotiate with the government of the United States to continue flexibilizing Venezuela. Europe is a clear objective for this. Why? Because Europe is going to help, of course, with the election, but Europe is looking for flexibilization in oil and gas, for example, because they are in the middle of a crisis. They need gas from Venezuela. They need to, for example, equality with Chevron for the European companies or the non-American companies. And the opposition has to negotiate it in order to link Europe, I think is fair, and in order to open the possibility to go for elections. So this is, in my opinion, the main objective, and is a very positive one.
Okay. Great. Thanks so much, Luis Vicente. We have just over 10 minutes left, and we have about 4 questions. So I'm going to read 2 questions from the chat, and we're going to take a couple of questions from the audience here, and then I'll just let each of you speak if you want to answer. From the chat, we have a question from Victorino Marquez, who writes, up till now, we have seen very little gains for the opposition in the Mexico talks. No release of political prisoners, not even an election date. NGOs are being further criminalized. The real opposition candidates are still disqualified from running. By contrast, Maduro has gained significant concessions, such as the dismantling of the interim government, certain degree of international tolerance. Don't you think that Maduro will outmaneuver the opposition once again? Also in the chat, Jorge Piedrahita writes, the consensus from this group is clear. The main outcome from the negotiations in Mexico is the consolidation of the hegemonic control of Maduro. But we just saw limits to Maduro's path in a place like Argentina, so that he was afraid of traveling there. What are the limits to Maduro's desires or plans? And would those limits surface in the negotiation process so that it may end up being another failure? And we have a couple of questions here. Rachel?
Sure. Do you want me to come up?
Yeah, why don't you come here?
I thank you all very much. I just wanted to ask briefly, it seems like a lot hinges on the opposition being able to come together and coalesce into some sort of more coherent movement. And I just wanted to better understand what is preventing the opposition from doing that and what might need to change in order for that to happen. Thanks.
And Ollie?
Hi again, thanks so much for the remarks. I have a related question, which is listening, especially to Luis Vicente's comments, making me think about the opposition. And I was wondering, how much has the process of displacement of Venezuelans out of the country, especially people who might be supporters of the opposition, how much is that shaping the degree of or proportion of support for Maduro within Venezuela? And is there any way that the diaspora at this point, or the people outside of Venezuela are having any influence, or their opinions are being taken into account, or can they be? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Oliver. So I'll let the three of you speak and answer the questions that of those that you'd like to address, and also make the final remarks that you'd like to, in whatever order, whoever jumps first.
It's for me. I mean, listen, I'm going to say something that is difficult to say, but we need to recognize, right? The opposition is coming very late to these talks, okay? When you're in an attrition conflict and you want to negotiate, you need to negotiate when you're strong, not when you're extremely weak. But you're coming to this negotiation table at a point where most of your strategy has fully failed, and you have not been able to accumulate sufficient resources to keep resisting with that same strategy. So you need to shift, right? So the current negotiation, the real negotiation, in my own understanding, is between the Maduro regime and the US. And the Maduro regime is sitting with the opposition because the US is asking the Maduro regime to sit with the opposition in order for them to window dress some concessions on different elements, from the social, oil, and even foreign policy issues, and individual sanctions even, okay? So what's going on, Victorino, is that what you need to pay to get the opposition, for Chavismo to accept to sit with the opposition, you need to pay a high entry bill for that to happen. And the US is willing to pay that bill, okay? I'm sorry to say this so honestly, because if you had negotiated 3 years, 4 years ago, would have been completely different. And when you were negotiating, the hardliners within the opposition were completely boycotting all the opposition, the negotiation process with the Maduro regime, okay? So when you come late, that's you need to pay that cost, okay? Now, Jorge is saying that the outcome is crystal clear. I'm not sure. There are miscalculations. Autocrats miscalculate. And we've learned this historically. And what you need to do is to force a deeper political opening of a hegemonic autocratic regime which is ruling Venezuela. And that means going to this election under better conditions than the ones that you managed to negotiate in 2021, which, by the way, were important concessions, among them the CNE, right? No one is talking now about removing the CNE, because that negotiation, which I happen to contribute a lot to it, was very serious about how to negotiate that electoral council. And Chavismo is not happy with the electoral council they have right now. And that's why they want to change it. So the discussion now moves, I think, if you're negotiating on behalf of the opposition, you need to focus on the candidates, on removing bans, a general removal of all the bans of potential presidential candidates, right? That's where my focus would be. And that perhaps you can achieve. Now, the negotiation, Jorge, is not going to guarantee you win the election. No way, friend. What guarantees that you win the election is that you get your act together, right? And you do exactly what you did in Barinas in 2021 to beat the regime, right? And this is what you need to do. You need to reach out to society. You need to reach out to different civil society organizations. You need to reach out to different political parties, even those you dislike, okay? And you need to do that sooner rather than later. So you need to do strategic coordination. You need to build trust. There's the question of how you're going to select the candidate, which is a big question. You know, I hear everyone talking about primaries. I love primaries, but this is, you know, I'm happy to see a hegemonic autocratic regime allowing free primaries. I want to see that, right? But perhaps it happens because there's no coordination. Perhaps the primaries are going to divide the opposition even further, right? So they might allow it and say, you see, we have a democracy here going on. Now, having said that, what is the type of candidate that I think can win on the opposition? One, you need to choose someone who has the popularity, right? Who has some popularity which you can build upon. Secondly, you need to choose a candidate that the regime is gonna accept, that they're gonna accept that they're defeated. If you go into this election threatening with existential issues of survival, then I don't see how they're gonna recognize that election, because it's not a normal electoral process. Third thing you need to recognize, whoever candidate it is, he or she needs to govern. You're going to confront a National Assembly with a Chavista supermajority, okay? Not very different from the kind of supermajority that Maduro had to confront to in 2015. So you need to govern, and without a judicial system that you control, and without the governors, and without the mayors, okay? So, and without the military. And finally, you need a candidate that can come out and say, I'm not gonna repeat. All this bullshit about some success, you know, all this thing about a permanent re-election with we're gonna stop that. So I'm here for one term, I'm here for a transition, and we'll build up Venezuelan democracy again from within. That's up to us. So it's not written in the wall that Maduro will win now. Having said that, the only reason I think Maduro wants to run is because he needs to win that election to consolidate the whole full regime, which he already controls, and have the international legitimacy. But that's up to us to define how he does that. Okay, so we need to pull that fight. I'll end up with another issue.
I mean, be mindful that we're running out of time, and I'd also like Carolina and Luis Vicente to get a last word.
Very briefly. The EU report says very clearly, the system counts the votes. Okay, so the tricks are not on the voting system. The tricks are on how the judicial system intervenes in the electoral system, on how the opposition can mobilize resources and access media, and how they install the electoral tables. Okay, so I'll leave it there. There's a lot of work to do, and we only have a year or two to do this. It's not much time that passes by very quickly.
Well, thanks very much, Michael. I know that we're running out of time, but I'd definitely like to give a chance if they can stay for Carolina and Luis Vicente to put in some last comments.
Yes, thank you, Francisco. I'll be very brief because, of course, I also want to give Luis Vicente a chance to speak. I am not part of a consensus, by the way, that Mexico implies the consolidation of the Maduro regime, etc. Because Mexico has not ended. Okay, Mexico is ongoing. It's difficult, no doubt. It's full of barriers and obstacles, yes, but Mexico has not ended. And if we have seen anything in Latin America, is the rise and fall of authoritarians. Okay, and I love looking at the Fujimori example, and even going back, to the Pinochet example, etc., because it teaches us that even at points where you don't think that the autocrats are going to lose power ever, things happen, and sometimes unpredicted situations with, organized civil society, political parties, etc., bring democracy back. So this more or less friendly environment that Maduro has right now in Latin America can change in the next 5 years. Okay, let's not forget that the region has become a pendulum, and that has an impact on Venezuelan politics as well.
Thank you, Carolina. Luis Vicente?
Yeah, well, I want to talk about the Maduro level of support. In the last poll, Maduro is around 26% of popularity, increasing, because he was 1 year ago in around 13 to 15%. So he increased, maybe linked with a better environment in economic terms, for example, is maybe one of the support of him, but he's still a minority, is 26% means, and it's more or less the same that his political party is a quarter of the country. 70% of the Venezuelans think that Maduro has to be out of power, and this is great. But in pragmatic ways, for example, if you have a presidential election, even with conditions, a presidential election with a high abstention rate, the people decide not to go and vote, etc., because they're full of troubles, fractures, divisions, etc. 26% is a lot. It's a lot, because you are going to increase in the campaign, you control the political system, and you are going to be at least 50% more than that, just because the majority of the Chavistas are able to vote, and the majority of the opposition has troubles voting because of the lack of confidence in the process. The difference between Venezuelans living in the United States or living abroad and the Venezuelans inside is bigger and bigger, bigger and bigger. It's a huge difference between them right now, because Venezuela's changed. Of course, it's not that we solve the problems. It's ridiculous. We lost 75% of our GDP from 2013 to 2021. So you are absolutely far from recover your position. But what is true is that the majority of Venezuelans think that they are better than in 2018. And they are, trying to live, to solve problems, to create businesses, to look for money, etc. And they lost the interest in politics. This is a huge problem for the election. If you talk to the Venezuelans living abroad, they are seeing a plane who went down from 40,000 feet to 10,000 feet. It's true. And this is true. But the Venezuelans living in the plane, they are feeling that they didn't crash. And they want to live. And they want money. And they want to make businesses. And they love to resolve, for example, the problem with sanctions. Venezuelan think that we have to flexibilize the sectorial sanctions in Venezuela to recover our position in gas and oil in the world. If you ask this to Venezuelans living abroad, the situation could be a little bit different, because they think that sanction means a punish for Maduro. In reality, sanctions became a punish for Venezuelan people, not for Maduro.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank all three of you, Carolina, Mike, Luis Vicente. I'd like to thank Ollie, ICRS, and the Latin America Center. And I hope that we can have this conversation again in the future. It's been really enlightening. And I'd definitely like to thank and give an acknowledgement to Saraf Nawar, who helped organize the whole meeting. So thanks again for everybody.
Thanks.
Look forward to seeing you again.